This is a presentation of mental illness in prisons for a course in psychopathology at Colorado Christian University in the summer of 2019. Group 4 consists of Brianna Allison, Erica Pack, Jill Fields, and Eric Witt.
Hi, my name is Brianna Allison, and this is a presentation on mental illness in prison settings. I want to just state a brief quotation on a staff member from Pennsylvania Penitentiary on just the humanity part of people in these types of settings. These are real people in a really difficult environment. How can you identify and treat these people, the people that so easily get lost in a system that's not set up for it, and not Hi, my name is Brianna Allison, and this is a presentation on mental illness in prison settings. I want to just state a brief quotation on a staff member from Pennsylvania Penitentiary on just the humanity part of people in these types of settings. These are real people in a really difficult environment. How can you identify and treat these people, the people that so easily get lost in a system that's not set up for it, and not have things get worse? We'll start off with just childhood experiences. They're coming from trauma and poverty and just really low income housing. What a professional said in one of the penitentiaries, they give a very awesome overview of like an example of where these people are coming from or where they're coming from. So some of these guys have had just crap lives from the get-go. They never had a chance. Bad brain, bad environment. It went downhill from there. You've got mom doing drugs and drinking while pregnant, dad doing drugs and beating on mom while she's pregnant. The baby's born premature, low birth weight. In the home, it's too many kids, not enough money, not enough space, very distracted, substance abusing parents. It's a chaotic environment. Kids growing up not knowing whether the parents are going to stroke them or hit them. The kid will usually be in an average intelligence or below average kid. By middle school, they're using drugs. By high school, a fair amount of drugs. Then a little crime, petty thefts, shoplifting. By middle teens, they're probably dropped out of high school and solidly in drug culture, maybe just working and doing some drinking. They end up doing some crimes for which they get busted with controlled substances. They've been in fights, car wrecks, head injuries, and then they end up in prison, early to mid 20s. This is not unusual, and sometimes it, which is mental illness, comes out when they're in prison, and in other times it's simply that they can't get away from where they are, and they can't blame it on a meth run. They really truly are delusionally paranoid, but they can't just move to the next town or to the next street when it gets in their way. And I really thought that just chunk of information of just a general background to an average prisoner inmate coming from just a harsh background, and that leads into drugs, this addictions, just not knowing, coming from these childhood experiences that aren't great, thinking they need to fill it with drugs, and there really isn't a clear understanding of what their drug choice is. Most of the time when they're in prisons, what they're coming from. It's called this garbage can of addiction, where they just can just get what they can just to fill that void. A lot of them are convicted, like what the professional said, of violent crimes and a lot of drug related offenses, just to soothe what this pain that they have experienced over the years from just childhood trauma. I think we see like it just relates back to how they were grown up and trying to feed something that was lost. There's a lot of just general, like there's pot, crack, heroin, depressants, hallucinogens, like it's a full range of drug abuse in this culture. There's also discriminatory incarceration. That is just a general idea of these inmates are coming in not based on of a crime, but of their mental disability. So that was a huge portion of why people are in this, in prisons in general. There's also just a huge stigma. A lot of the prisoners just hold back and don't say anything because they're going to get locked in a cell by themselves. They're going to have to do this, just increased consequences if they're not fully honest. So they just stay mild in what their history was of mental illness, so they don't get that increased consequence. There's a plethora of disorders. There's schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar, major depression, excuse me, which there's just a huge range, but it's not as common as I thought it was going to be, the mental illness, that there's also quite a few prisoners who just don't have a mental illness going in, but they could end up having a mental illness because of the stressful environments that are placed, like crime or just fights and arguments in prisons. There's a lot of depressive and substance use disorders in the prisons as
everyone, my name is Erica Pack, and I will be doing the research portion of our project. The American Disability Act, Title II in particular, protects inmates from discrimination from programs and services that are provided in prison. The ADA recognizes the use of prisons as long-term care facilities, and this happened because of the deinstitutionalization that took place in our country several decades ago. As a result, 42 to 50% of the mentally ill will come in contact with the criminal justice system. In 1999, a court case of Olmstead versus LC recognized the unnecessary institutionalization of mental illness and elevated people with mental disabilities from people who need protection to people who can make a contribution to community life. In another study in Al Rusan, it states that the U.S. has the highest rates of incarceration in the world. The correctional facilities have become a frontline for mental health care. There are 10 times more people with serious mental illnesses in prisons and jails than there are in state hospitals. And in particular, Iowa has a 50% rate of mental illness in their prisons. We need to update this census because the last one that was taken was in 2004. Mental illness is associated with an 8-fold increase odds of comorbidity with both substance use and abuse history. States is not the only one seeing this problem in prisons. Also in Great Britain, one Her Majesty's Prison Service shows that 90% of adult prisoners have at least one mental health illness, 70% have 2 or more, 10% have a serious mental illness, 40% of males have neurotic disorder, and 62% of males have a personality disorder. And then a study done by East has overall rates of mental disorders significantly higher than the rest of the UK. And up until 2013, there was a healthcare wing within Her Majesty's Prison Service which managed the mentally ill prisoners. There was a 14-bed unit that was run 24 hours a day, but in 2013, they got rid of that whole program, and now workers only work 9 to 5, no weekends, and no after-hour calls. So the result of that is the mentally ill are put in solitary confinement in order to manage them. The most recent study that I found was done in Chile in 2019, which showed that they had 247 people imprisoned per 100,000 population compared to 144 people worldwide. Their occupancy in their prison is 110% with poor conditions. They have higher rates of suicide and affective disorder compared to high-income countries. And the same thing that we see in every other country is that there's an increase in prison populations is associated with a decrease in psychiatric hospital beds in South America as it is everywhere else. There was a 3-year follow-up study that showed significantly less major mental illness, including depression and psychiatric disorders, for those prisoners who worked for remuneration or studied during imprisonment. In 2013, Galenek did a study on the US, and it showed that 15 to 20% of inmates in the US have severe psychiatric disorder, such as schizophrenia, bipolar, and major depressive disorder. And these have comorbidities of substance abuse and or personality disorders. Among this population, there's a history of homelessness, residencies in high crime areas, the family history of incarceration, substance abuse, or physical or sexual abuse while incarcerated. Their history creates a substantially different prototypical case than that of a middle-class Anglo assumed in the DSM's model of illness. A Pacific Northwest prison has 11 full-time staff for a 2,000-bed maximum security male prisoner, who operates as the frontline staff for mental health services. They're responsible for psychiatric evaluations, case management, crisis management, and short-term interventions. Overall,
Hi, my name is Jill, and I'm going to be talking about the applicability of mental health among prisoners and how it relates to community providers and how they might use this information to make an impact. Let's begin by talking about the need for support among prisoners who are being released. One of the most significant needs that inmates need upon release from the prison system is support in the form of providing housing, jobs, and health care. Success of the prisoner is largely dependent on the support that they receive from the community around them. Prisoners being released, however, will find that community support is often lacking. One such example is that of a New Jersey parole board that had pledged $4.2 million to establish a resource center for ex-prisoners to find jobs, housing, and health care. However, the community around the center did not support it due to safety concerns and a lack of communication among the community. So all that being said, there are several fundamental problems existing in the current re-entry programs according to Kirchner. The first is that ex-inmates are ill-prepared to transition back to home life and the emotional and logistical issues that might bring. State, county, and city agencies are also failing to coordinate and deliver needed services to prisoners prior to release. Lastly, communities as a whole are ill-equipped to meet the needs of returning prisoners. So, all of this begs the question, how does this relate to mental health within the prison system? Well, to start, statistically speaking, mental health seems to be a much more significant issue in prison. While only 5% of the general population are suffering from a severe mental disorder, 16% in prison are suffering from the same issues. Likewise, 53% of the prison population have a substance abuse disorder, while only 8.5% of the general population have the same difficulties. By looking at statistics alone, it seems that prisoners with mental health disorders are lacking significant support upon release. So the high prevalence of mental and substance abuse makes it even more difficult for ex-prisoners to transition and become successful adults. In addition, individuals with mental and substance abuse disorders are more likely to suffer from longer sentences, serve time in segregation during jail time, and will experience victimization and exploitation. Prisoners with mental health issues who are coming out of the jail system are also lacking resources and support upon their release. So the next question is, how do we begin to fix the issue? There are 4 main ways that can help. First, it is important to conduct universal screening for prisoners as early as the booking and intake process to have early detection of substance abuse disorders, mental health disorders, or co-occurring mental health and substance abuse disorders. For those who have positive screens, follow up with comprehensive assessments, including basic demographics, identifying basic clinical needs, identifying strengths and protective factors for the inmate, and providing social and community support are all important. Inmates need to have developed individualized treatment plans to determine the appropriate level of intensity in order to promote a high success rate upon entering back into their communities. It is important within the first few weeks of release to identify community and correctional programs that will be beneficial for the inmate and develop practices that promote continuity of care upon their release. Lastly, it is important to support adherence to the treatment plans and supervision conditions, including providing incentives and treatment and establishing clear protocols across the jail and community systems. There must be an establishment of encouragement and support to cross-train and facilitate collaboration between workforces and agencies who are working with those with mental health and substance abuse disorders. It is important to set some healthy goals in order to provide better support for inmates being released. One such goal is facilitating regular interaction with former inmates and potential role models, especially those who have already made the transition themselves. It is also important to try to prevent ex-inmates from being isolated or idle after gaining their freedom. Lastly, it is important to prepare the local community for ex-inmates' re-entry by encouraging community members to participate in opportunities to help the inmate find success.
Hello, I'm Eric Witt, and I would like to present on what the Bible has to say about mental illness in prisons. The Bible is full of examples of mental illness, which are clearly a part of the history of mankind. In fact, Deuteronomy 28 indicates that madness would be a part of the results of Israel's disobedience to God's design. In 1 Samuel, Israel's first earthly king, Saul, acted irrationally and violently towards others in response to a tormenting spirit. In the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon sought to understand madness more deeply in his search for wisdom. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon was driven into the wilderness for 7 years in madness with the loss of reason. And the New Testament also presents several examples of demonic possession and oppression, and today these afflictions would be addressed as mental illness. While the Bible fully acknowledges mental illness in its various forms, it also promises restoration. Matthew 4:24 gives an account of Jesus' healing, indicating that he was able to heal all types of illness and oppression. Healing is available, but it can seem far away for those who are in prison. The Word of God uses the concept of prison and bondage throughout history with both physical and spiritual examples. The very fall of mankind presented in Genesis 3 is what resulted in our bondage into death. Exodus describes Israel's slavery in Egypt as an example of prison and bondage in this world, and the people of God have often been imprisoned, as detailed in both the Old and New Testaments. In fact, in all of history since that time. The stories about Joseph, Daniel, and Jonah are both cautionary and ultimately encouraging, and the apostles were frequently imprisoned throughout each of their ministries, and of course, Jesus Christ was bound on the way to the cross. Thankfully, that very mission that Jesus would accomplish was to proclaim liberty and to set captives free, a mission that followers of Christ share too. In 1 Timothy, Paul says that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, and this is no less true in the systems of prisons that we have in the world today. In addition to corruption, systems that are not directed by God are often uncoordinated and misguided. Proverbs says that there's a way that seems right, but that it ends in death. Truly genuine yet broken people can often become what Jesus described as blind guides and fail to help, even when there's a desire present to do so. As outlined early in the presentation, the prison environment is not conducive to healing from mental illness. There's isolation, more exposure to violence, and to other mental illnesses in high percentages. Resources are limited, and they very often must be intentionally sought out, something an inmate may be unable or unwilling to do. Fortunately, God promises to be available when he's sought, to provide healing and protection for his people, and that he is able to bring about good from every situation, even prison. In fact, all the biblical accounts I have previously mentioned work out for good in the end. God plainly says that he often uses affliction to refine, grow, and heal his people. A prison experience has often resulted in an enlightened life through a spiritual perspective. We see this throughout history and even in modern times with such examples as John Bunyan, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Viktor Frankl. There is hope. As God has said, along with countless songwriters, love is the answer. Jesus describes how his followers will act in love, sitting with the ill and the imprisoned. The call to love one's neighbor is second only to loving God. Hebrews and Psalms share that true fellowship is encouraging, pleasant, and life-filling. The book of Acts describes the newly formed fellowship of believers, and that community included healing. There is power in love and in relationship, and it is reflected in the principles that counselors apply in the therapeutic environment. Just as Isaiah responded to God's call, I believe that Christian counselors can respond to the needs of mental illness in prisons. Ephesians says that the help we can provide was designed by God and placed within us. James cautions that we should always do what we know is right, and that we were called to act as we look into the liberty that's provided in Jesus Christ. In fact, James describes pure religion as being with orphans and widows, and many of both were created by our current prison systems, and people need help. Again, the mission of Jesus Christ is to proclaim liberty and to set free the oppressed. As his followers, we receive that call. We should grow into the body of Christ according to our ability. We who do this as Christian counselors need to advocate for healing and love with our clients, as well as with the systems in which we work. In this way, we can advocate for the mentally ill in prison, and we can also seek to improve the systems which will provide support for many other helpers and clients to come.